question asks, what type of muscle is in this picture? So would anyone like to tell me which type of muscle this is? Your choices are cardiac, skeletal, smooth. I saw lots of people with the right answer, so you're probably right, yeah. This is definitely skeletal muscle. So give yourself a mark if you said that it was skeletal muscle. Now, why do we know that it's skeletal muscle? So there's more than one nuclei. That would be perfect as an explanation. Is there another reason that someone put that this has to be skeletal muscle? It has striations. And I think there's even one more thing you could say if you wanted to. I'll add the third one in. It's a tube shape, so it's tubular, but it's not branched. So cardiac muscle looks fairly similar to a skeletal muscle, except it has fewer nuclei. It's still striated, and it's tubular, but it's branched. So on this question, we'll give 2 points. One for saying it was skeletal muscle, one for saying the reason why. Now the next question asks, if you hurt your quadricep muscle, but your hamstring was okay, what would be the effect on the motion of your leg? So in this question number 2, I'm asking you to think about how muscles work in pairs. They always have to work together. And so some people might say, oh, well, your leg could do one thing but not the other. And in reality, your leg could do neither motion. So if you put, you would not be able to do flexion or extension, that's what we're looking for here. Now here's why. My muscles have to work in pairs. If my quad can't do anything, that means it cannot help my leg move. Now, if it can't contract, that means that I can't relax it either. That's the inference here. Since we haven't fully discussed what actually happens when a muscle contracts, I'm going to accept 2 different answers here. The other answer I'll accept is if you simply said, I could not do extension. Now let's say that you didn't use the words extension and flexion. The motion that you need your quadricep to contract for is to kick your leg forward. Kicking it back is what you need your hamstring to contract for. So if you didn't say the word extension, but you described that you wouldn't be able to kick your leg forward, that would be the same thing for me. So I'll accept either one of those answers, and we're just going to put it out of 1. Now question number 3 has a number of correct answers. I'm going to say that it's out of 2, and I'm going to show you an example of how you would get 2 marks. My example will be maintaining constant temperature. So that's the part where I say what homeostasis thing I'm talking about. Homeostasis is the idea that your body maintains constant internal conditions. So if you said something about the word constant, or keeping levels at the right spot, or keeping things the same, something that means that, that would be what I'm looking for the homeostasis part. And how do your muscles do that? Shivering produces heat. So if you shiver, then you will increase your body temperature back up to the normal constant temperature your body is hoping for. So I'm looking for what constant condition are you maintaining, and what is your muscle doing to help maintain that. So that's how you would get 2 marks. Do people want to volunteer other suggestions for what your muscles do to maintain homeostasis? Oh, everyone's excited today. So yesterday we filled out examples about your digestive system and how, since muscles help food move through your digestive system, that helps you maintain blood sugar levels, let's say. We talked about your respiratory system. Since muscles are what is making you breathe, they help you maintain oxygen and CO2 levels. We mentioned your excretory system. Since muscles are controlling the exit of things from your bladder / excretory system, they're helping maintain water levels and pH levels. So those are some of the examples that we gave yesterday. What else is on the list? Muscles work with protection, so to help protect things from damage. That would be another example. Does anyone have an example that I didn't mention that you're unsure of? Yeah. Oh, movement absolutely would be one. So movement is the thing we most commonly associate with muscles. Muscles help you move, and movement, you would have to say which homeostasis thing you're talking about for the other mark, but movement could help you with protection, like keeping you away from danger. Movement could help you with other things, like movement could be helping you generate heat. Movement could be helping you acquire food so that you could digest it. So as long as you said what thing I'm doing with movement, that would be fine as well. The last question is just out of one. Which is bigger, a muscle cell or a myofilament? And the answer is a muscle cell. A myofilament is a piece that is part of a muscle cell. So if I take a look at this, it is out of 6. We'll start this. Myoglobin is really important when we talk about oxygen. So just like you have hemoglobin in your blood, you have myoglobin. Remember, myo is a prefix that refers to muscles. So when you're looking at scientific words, if you see myo or sarco, you know we're talking about muscles. Now the thing that I'd like you to really remember, it is for oxygen binding. So just like hemoglobin binds oxygen in your blood, this does it in your muscles. And we need oxygen for muscle contraction because we need to do cell respiration if we're going to have muscle contraction. So in this unit, I will refer to cell respiration a number of times. I'm not going to ask you in this particular chapter to say, repeat the Krebs cycle to me, but I want you to be aware of the fact that cell respiration is happening. Now the next few pieces are all in terms of your muscle cell itself. So they're parts of the muscle cell. They all start with sarco. And like I mentioned yesterday, sarco is telling us we're talking about a muscle cell. The sarcolemma is the membrane of a muscle cell. That's what it is. And the function is that it does the same thing maybe a cell membrane would do. Cell membranes are there to surround the cell and to allow selective entry and exit. So in your textbook it says it regulates, and I like that word. It regulates the entry and exit of molecules in and out of muscle cells. Now the sarcoplasm, just like cytoplasm, is the fluid. So we could say it's the cytoplasm of the muscle cell. Now what's the point of having cytoplasm? Well, for us, this is where a lot of metabolic processes happen. And so, for example, you know already that glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of a cell. Since glycolysis is the first step of cell respiration, and if I'm out of oxygen, the only step of cell respiration I'm going to do, this is where it's happening. Now, Sarcoplasmic Reticulum is next. You may remember learning about the endoplasmic reticulum in general when you talked about cells in grade 10. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is the smooth endoplasmic reticulum in a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. And its job is to store calcium. Calcium is particularly important for muscle contraction. So lots of people have maybe this misconception that calcium is good for your bones and your teeth, and that's about it. But in fact, if you were calcium deficient, it would greatly reduce the ability of your muscles to contract. Now, the last two things are the myofibrils. So what is a myofibril in general? It's a bundle of filaments, and there are two types. You have actin and myosin, the thick and the thin filament. So the function of myofibrils really is muscle contraction. That's the topic where we'll discuss some specific details about them. Now we have a thick one and a thin one. The thick one is called myosin, and the thin one is called actin. And we'll see in our class tomorrow when we talk about the mechanics of muscle contraction at a cellular level, what each of them does. But very briefly, these two filaments bind together and then they slide. And that is what causes muscle contraction. So that you know, the one that has act in its name is the one that is actually going to move. So actin moves during muscle contraction. Myosin, we'll see, doesn't. Your textbook just says they bind to each other and cause muscle contraction without any more detail than that. And we'll get to the details in our next lesson. So those are the words that you needed to define. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask about any of those definitions? So you can expect that on tomorrow's daily review, I will ask you about these words for sure, now that we've discussed them. All right, so we are on Unit 2, Lesson 2. I put this awesome little cartoon up here that says, I'm not coming to work today because I did squats yesterday. One of my aunts constantly sends me these like kind of ridiculous sarcastic e-cards, and usually they're totally not school appropriate, but this one I thought was very relevant. And I'm going to make you do something like a squat today, so this might be relevant to you tomorrow. So the topic of today's lesson are fast twitch and slow twitch fibers, and this is the only slide of notes that we're going to discuss today. Now, when we talk about your muscle fibers, and I'm just going to remind you that a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. There are generally two main categories. Now, does that mean that there's nothing in between? Of course not. I'm showing you the two extremes because this is usually how we categorize things, because they have very distinctive characteristics. The first type of muscle fiber is called a fast twitch muscle fiber, and that's what's described on the left. If I had to give one line, one description of what a fast twitch muscle fiber is, I would say that it is for rapid generation of power. Power being kind of the key word. So if any of you have ever played a sport where you have shifts, like you go on and then someone else comes off and then you go back on, etc., you might have heard your coach say shorter shifts are better. And that's because in that type of situation, you are probably looking for rapid generation of power. Now, here are some characteristics of fast twitch fibers. First, little to no myoglobin, and we just saw what the myoglobin was. This is the oxygen binding protein. These types of muscles then look lighter. So if you think about when you eat turkey at Christmas, Thanksgiving, or maybe never, but if you've ever eaten a turkey, there's light meat and dark meat. You're eating the turkey's muscles, that's what you're eating, And their color is probably based in part on this. So little to no myoglobin, that means very little stored oxygen. They're lighter in color, so they're not necessarily white. You know, they might be kind of pinkish or beige looking, but a lot of the time we would call these the white fibers, simply because they're much lighter in color. Now, because they have little to no myoglobin, they depend on anaerobic energy generation. So you know from the last unit that when a cell does not have oxygen readily available, anaerobic respiration or fermentation is what is happening. That means that in these types of muscles, lactic acid will be produced quite soon. Now, the reason that they fatigue quickly, which is the next point, is based on the information that came above. Fatigue means they run out of oomph, they run out of energy, and that's because anaerobic respiration, not only does it produce lactic acid, but it produces way less ATP. So your muscles have less energy available to them. So this type of muscle is good for anything that has to happen in a burst. So for example, a sprint, or the power it takes to swing a racket, or the power it takes to shoot a stick or a club, any of those types of motions are using your fast twitch muscle fibers. Another really good example would be any sort of weightlifting, because you are lifting the weight usually just once at a time, and you need rapid generation of power, but it doesn't have to last for an extended period of time. So I'm just going to add the word weightlifting here to go with my super bit ripped guy that I put a picture of there. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have slow twitch muscle fibers. And so if we take all of the characteristics of a fast twitch muscle fiber and say the opposite of it, that will be a slow twitch fiber. So your slow twitch fibers are for endurance. These are for activities that you need to do for a long, extended period of time. Now, as opposed to my fast twitch muscle fibers, they are dark because they have lots of myoglobin. They depend on aerobic generation because since they have lots of myoglobin, they have lots of oxygen. Instead of fatiguing quickly, they resist fatigue, and they're good for anything that is prolonged. So I put a picture of someone running a marathon. That would be a really extreme case of endurance muscles. Even something as simple as going for a jog would require your slow twitch fibers. So if you ask yourself, am I going to do the activity for more than about a minute? Now that's not a hard rule there. That's just me giving you an estimate. Are you going to do one singular activity for more than a minute? So just to give you a comparison, if I were lifting weights, I'm not talking how long are you going to lift weights for total. I'm saying how long are you going to lift one weight for? How long are you going to do one activity? If you're going to lift one weight and hold it for more than 1 minute, then you're not using your fast twitch muscle fibers anymore. Now you're starting to use your slow twitch muscle fibers. Now, so that you know, there are technically things called intermediate muscle fibers that are kind of like fast twitch and kind of like slow twitch. And during our muscle fiber activity today, I'm going to ask you to look them up in your textbook. But when I ask you questions, I'm going to focus on the two extremes, since they have very distinctive characteristics. And intermediate muscle fibers, it's quite gray. Sometimes they're one way, sometimes they're another way. Now, the other thing that I'd like to look at is something called a myogram. So let me remind you, myo means muscle, and when I have the word gram, it means that I'm going to look at some sort of graph. So basically, a myogram is a muscle graph, a graph showing me the function of muscles over time. So what we're going to do is take a minute and look at a few questions in your textbook that have to do with the two types of muscle fibers and that have to do with myograms. So the first one that I'd like to look at is on page 350. And it's number 8. I'm going to start with the graph on page 350 that had A through G. You could expect a graph very similar to this one on a quest about muscles. Probably not with that many choices, because as you might have seen, it would be really hard to distinguish between a couple of them, but definitely with, say, 3 or 4 choices that were different enough from each other that you would be able to rank them. So when we look at this list, here's what you should notice. The first few choices are all people who have more fast twitch muscles than slow twitch muscles in varying degrees. And the last few choices are people who have more slow twitch muscle than fast twitch muscle. And the one right in the middle has 50% exactly of each type. So when we look at, I'm going to look at the end of the list first, F and G. Now, according to the textbook, G is the extreme endurance, and F is the marathon runner. And there were some people who asked me, what's the difference? I couldn't tell you. I don't know what the difference between these two types of sports is. And so for me, I think you could have interchanged those two and I still would have marked you as correct. So if I was going to ask you this question on a quest, I wouldn't put both of those as choices. I would say have one of them. And the person who had way more slow twitch fiber than fast twitch fiber would be the person who was, say, the marathon runner. So as long as your last two were extreme endurance and marathon, whichever order you put them in should be appropriate. The middle distance runner should be the one that is E, because of course they don't run as far as a marathon, but they're still doing running. Now D is the one that is right in the middle, and this is your average person. The average person has about the same amount of both. And this is why, if you've ever gone to any sort of training program, whether it's at school or at a gym, hopefully they tell you that you should work on cardio-based things, but also strength training. And this will help you keep this balance of half and half. Now, as we start to move into the top category, we have our sedentary person, our sprinter, and our spinal injury person. And without knowing a lot of details about these, it might have been hard for you to classify them based on which one goes where. The spinal injury would be A. Why? If you have a spinal injury, are you going to be doing any sort of endurance, running anywhere? Unlikely, because you probably cannot walk. Depending on the location of your spinal injury, you may not even be able to use your arms. And so since someone with a spinal injury could do only movements, probably that required fast twitch muscles, that's why they would be at the top of this list. Now the sprinter comes a close second. So if you had mixed those two up, like put the sprinter for A and the spinal injury somewhere else, I think that's still a reasonable thought process. And then your sedentary person would go here. So is it super crucial that you had everybody in the exact right spot? No, but it is pretty important that you had those two people last, and that the middle distance runner was on the side of having more slow twitch fibers. It's really important that you had your average person right in the middle, and that you had these three people on the other side, since they would have done predominantly fast twitch muscle movements. Does anyone want to ask any questions there? So then on page 353, number 23, we're asking you the same sort of question, but now we're talking about the differences when you're comparing muscle tissue. So the idea is that A and B will probably have more fast twitch muscles, and C will probably have more slow twitch muscles. And it's asking, what will the researcher see? So what kind of visible characteristics will you have? So this is where you could put something like what color the muscle might be. These muscles might be darker. These muscles might be lighter in color. That would be something that the researcher would see when comparing muscle tissue. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask there? So then following this, we'll go back to page 350. The question is asking you to draw a myogram. And where you could find this in your textbook is actually the page before, page 346. So if you wanted to flip all the way to page 346, that's where the diagram that answers the next few questions can be found. So for number 4 and 5, it's asking you to draw two different types of diagrams. Number 4 is asking you about normal muscle contraction. And number 5 is asking you about a muscle that is not allowed to relax completely in between contractions. And then question 13 and 14 show you these pictures and ask you to label them. So I'm going to just do this once, and it'll in fact answer the other few questions that were from the textbook. Normally during muscle contraction, you have what is called the latent period. This is the space between the stimulus and when your muscle actually starts contracting. So in your textbook, there's like a little arrow right there. That's the stimulus. That's something that's telling your muscle to contract, and then it doesn't happen instantaneously. There's a space, and your muscles have to contract. Following that latent period, where your muscle got the signal and is now contracting, we have contraction and relaxation periods. So normally, your muscle will get a signal, there'll be a little space of time, it'll contract, and then it will relax. Now for this to be a true graph, we have to have an x and a y axis. On the x-axis would be time, and on the y-axis would be force, so the force of your muscle contracting. Now for number 5, we'll set up the same kind of graph, force along the y-axis, time along the x-axis. But in this graph, we're going to have a whole bunch of little arrows on the bottom. That's indicating that there is not just one stimulus. There's a whole bunch of them continuously telling my muscle, contract, 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 contract. So when you look at this diagram, it kind of starts out looking the same right here, where it goes up and it goes down, but we don't let the muscle have time to relax. And so when you talk about what's going on here, there's a word that you might have heard before, and I'll actually start with it instead of what's first. The word tetanus. Some of you may know that you get a shot for tetanus and you didn't know what it was. Well, here's what tetanus is. It's sustained muscle contraction. The part before tetanus is called summation. If you think of what a sum is mathematically, I'm adding things up. And on the other side, where the line goes down, we have fatigue. So that's different than relaxation. Relaxation means my muscle is letting go slowly on purpose. Fatigue is where my muscle can no longer hold the contraction.